Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with an incredibly healthy looking Matt Kelly for another episode of the award winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. It is good to be back.
I wanted to explore the current imbroglio we see with the Department of Justice and Boeing over an upcoming decision that the DOJ is going to have to make about whether to try and criminally prosecute Boeing under the current Deferred Prosecution Agreement for the 737 MAX cases. And if not, what might be an appropriate remedy, sanction, or other that the DOJ could put in place going forward. And in thinking about this, I've been thinking a lot about what is the purpose of a criminal justice system. It may be a little bit clearer when it's individuals. Retribution, I think, is one component. Justice for the victims is another component. Remediation, or having a criminal repay a debt to society and come back into society, is another one. What are maybe some of your thoughts on those issues?
Those are some pretty deep questions, and I don't think that those issues apply to Boeing here. For example, we should remember that at the heart of this case are the families of 346 people who were killed in the two plane crashes of the MAX 737 jets at the end of the 2010s. And those families suffered tremendous losses, and they do deserve some sense of justice. At the same time, it is also true that the rest of us who rely on Boeing to fly in their planes, we do have a vested interest in a changed corporate culture at Boeing, one that is more attuned to safety risks and encouraging a really open discussion in corporate culture to slow down the production of planes, slow down the profit quest at Boeing so that everybody can be assured that the planes are safe. And right now we don't have that, because those two plane crashes happened in the 2010s, but the door that blew off of a Boeing airliner mid-flight, that just happened a couple of months ago to Alaska Airlines. Boeing and Airbus both are currently looking into rumors and allegations that they have been using falsified or contaminated titanium in their parts. And that may lead to more safety risks later on. People are not sure about it, but there's a whole lot of corporate culture issues at Boeing, and that is something everybody else is supposed to worry about, because I am deeply sympathetic to the families of the 346 crash victims. I also do not want to become the 347th or more crash victim because of sloppy Boeing corporate culture. We have two different threads we're trying to juggle here, or that the Justice Department is trying to juggle here. And I don't know that absolute justice for one would serve interests of the other. And what I mean is that the families are saying Boeing should be brought to a criminal conviction. That would prevent Boeing from being a defense contractor. It would shut down the planes that Boeing is manufacturing. It would throw tens of thousands of Boeing employees out of a job. And I'm not sure that makes aviation any safer, even though it gives those family victims a greater sense of justice. So do we give them money, which I'm sure is helpful, but is that really all that we're doing here, is putting a price on pain? Because that also seems to come up a bit short. So there are a couple of conflicting issues for the Justice Department. And then, Tom, my last point is, at the same time, corporate compliance officers do have a fascinating issue here about how are we handling deferred prosecution agreements? How does the department decide one has been violated? If one has been violated, what are you supposed to do to handle that corporate offender? And we don't have many cases of a DPA being found in violation or voided, or whatever the term might be. So compliance officers who are wondering, what happens if I'm under a DPA and then that DPA unravels? We don't have many examples of that. And this is one of the only ones, and it's still forthcoming. And we still have a lot of questions about that on a very practical basis. So there's a ton of stuff to get through here, and I don't know that we have clear answers for any of it.
The Justice Department was one of the four original departments of the U.S. government. It calls itself the People's Law Firm, the people being the United States, people of the United States. Does that constituency make sense as part of the analysis? Do they represent you and I, the airline flying public? Do they represent the government and what it may need as one of the national security contractors around aerospace? And you articulated several more, the employees who work for Boeing, the air traveling public, the U.S. commercial airlines who purchase from Boeing. There's a lot of interest in here. Is that all part of the difficulty in this decision?
I think so, because if Boeing, or if, I'm sorry, if the Justice Department is going to be the people's law firm, there's a lot of people in the United States, and they have a lot of different views and perspectives and experiences and interests. And I think you're right about that. Clearly, then, you and I and just about everybody listening would be part of the people, but we are, I think, not part of the 346 families who suffered a huge loss. But those 346 families definitely also need some sort of representation and sense of justice and some attempt to make them whole. It's never going to be perfect because we can't bring those people back who died in the crash. But so does that mean that they get money as financial compensation? If so, could that be handled through civil litigation and let the Justice Department somehow rehabilitate Boeing? And that serves the interests of all the other people. Maybe that would be one way to go about it. I'm not sure that's the right way or the wrong way. And we still have a whole lot of questions about rehabilitating the corporation of Boeing. What does that mean? What does it mean when you're already under a DPA? And what do compliance officers have to think? And what sort of new remedies might the prosecutors try to impose, since they have said that Boeing has, in their opinion, violated the DPA? And we still are not entirely clear on exactly what did Boeing not do, or what did it do that violated. That's still very opaque and subjective. And unless there was a filing quietly made while I was on vacation last week, I don't think that the government has actually specified what Boeing did or didn't do to violate its DPA.
Is one of the potential remedies, no, that's not the right way to phrase this question. Do you have to put a financial penalty so high or make it so painful that a company finally says, okay, we get it, we need to reform our culture? Or do you think we're way past something as basic as that?
I don't know that financial penalties are, in fact, the correct way to go here. And I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago, and I had a conversation with Indiana University business ethics professor Todd Haw, who has followed DPAs and corporate prosecutions a lot. And we were talking about it. And both of us were coming to the conclusion that maybe there are other operational limits that regulators could put on a company that might be more of an incentive for it to change the culture. If it's just a matter of pay this much money and that will drive you to change the corporate culture. No, it won't. It will drive the company to pay that much money. And then it might try to engage in some corporate culture reform for a while. And then the DPA expires and it reverts back to norm. On the other hand, if you put some real practical operational limits on what the company can do, that's the sort of thing that will drive management and the board up a wall. They will be desperate to get away from those operational limits. And what do I mean? A practical example of that actually comes from our corporate example. The gift that keeps on giving is Wells Fargo, where banking regulators told Wells, yes, you have to pay an obscene amount of money for all its many corporate offenses in the 2010s. But they also said, and we are capping your assets that you can have at $2 trillion. And for a large bank like Wells Fargo, that is a significant limit on its growth. That, I think, more than fines would drive Wells Fargo to try and reform its culture. So how would regulators impose similar sort of operational limits on non-bank companies? That's what we'd have to think about. I didn't know this until recently, Tom, but apparently the Federal Aviation Administration has put a cap on the number of planes that Boeing can make per year, except that cap is so high, Boeing was never in any danger of cranking out that many planes anyways. Never mind that these days, all of their airline customers are taking 3 big steps back and don't want to buy them. But maybe something like that, where the department, the Justice Department, pairs up with civil regulators who really could impose strict operational limits and impose compliance monitors and enhanced reporting. And maybe that would drive the deep cultural change that we're talking about, much more than just additional financial penalties. That's coming, but a company can always pay additional financial penalties. It's kind of sort of buying your way out of the problem as opposed to really changing the problem. And we should appreciate that distinction.
I wouldn't even say kind of, sort of. I would just say buying your way out of the problem. And that really brings us to one potential remedy that we've touched on and is, I think, in open discussions. That's a monitorship. The other variable that we didn't discuss is a federal district judge who currently has jurisdiction over Boeing for the DPA. And he has said, number one, this is the worst corporate crime in the history of America, in his opinion. But two, because of the restrictions federal judges have around their rights to agree, disagree, or accept a deferred prosecution agreement, they basically just have to accept it. And I don't know if his oversight he may decide it's going to extend, and it's going to actually take a deep dive into whatever remedy the Department of Justice and Boeing agree to when they come before him, whatever that might be. But let's maybe move over to the monitor. You and I both know people who've been monitors. We've seen some, I think, very successful monitorships, at least in the FCPA arena. And I think a monitorship can be successful, but only if the company wants it to be. And are we stuck with that basic question?
I've been giving some thought to the monitorship. I do think that I suspect that the department is going to push for a monitor now because they did not have a monitor in their first DPA. And now, at least in the eyes of the prosecutors, the DPA didn't take. So you need something more stringent. You need probably a monitor. But then I would have some questions there. Number two, are we talking about somebody what sort of power and control would they have over Boeing? Maybe something closer to a receiver. And I don't know if there's a monitor turned receivership, how novel of an idea that might be, but somebody who really could not just monitor, but play a much stronger role in offering Boeing advice on its corporate culture. Maybe we could borrow from SEC enforcement where they don't have monitors per se, but they have compliance consultants, quote unquote, who are really monitors, but are giving extensive guidance to the SEC sanctioned company about here's what we want for policies and procedures and everything else. Would the monitor be able to do that? What sort of reports would Boeing need to make, not just to the monitor, but maybe to the Justice Department directly? They already typically do make these annual reports to the fraud section of DOJ. Would they maybe have them quarterly or some other sort of more frequent reporting? Tom, my big thing is maybe it would make sense to have those compliance monitor reports because the monitor will also be making annual reports at least to the fraud section. Could those monitor reports be made public? Which typically they are not. But if you wanted to hold Boeing's feet to the fire and you wanted to show transparency to everybody else, such as the survivors, the families of the crash victims there, maybe that would be the way to do it. And maybe that would get Boeing to take real progress even more sincerely and honestly, is to know that all of this information is going to be made public in real time. I do think, for the record, that monitorships can work. And this is another item that just streaked across my radar a couple of weeks ago. One company that is under a monitorship is the Wynn Resorts in Las Vegas. They're under a monitorship with state gaming regulators here in Massachusetts, where Wynn has a large casino. And because of the nature of that monitorship, those monitor reports have sometimes been made public. And most recently, that monitor filed a statement with Massachusetts regulators saying Wynn's done a great job and their culture has changed dramatically. And we think that the monitorship can even end early. So there is evidence out there from other companies in a very different context, but nonetheless, there's evidence out there that monitorships do work. But there's a lot of skepticism here now, and deservedly, that Boeing isn't taking it seriously, hasn't lived up to its expectations before. How would we address that? by doing the same thing over and over again, or by doing something different. And maybe the different thing to do would be A, appoint a monitor, and B, bring more visibility into the monitorship process. Nothing that says you can't, it's just not typically done. But if Boeing and the department agree to it, I think that would be a fantastic way to bring more integrity and accountability to this monitorship process.
Matt, we have focused on the Department of Justice, although I've raised the issue of the U.S. federal district judge, but that there's another major player in this ongoing saga, and that's the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA. And I'm going to assume the FAA has the expertise to do the technical aviation work. Could the FAA be a part of this criminal solution as well? Or is your sense that the FAA, because of the criticism it has received over its kid gloves treatment of Boeing, they're going to stay away from whatever the Department of Justice decides?
That is an excellent question, Tom. You said you assume that the FAA has the technical expertise. I don't know that I'm ready to make that assumption, because they were not impressive first time around when the FAA essentially outsourced its inspections to Boeing for its MAX 37 jets. And look where that got us. So I don't know. Now, I can appreciate that the leadership of the FAA turns over regularly, and especially if it turned over from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. However, if this flips back over and we wind up putting in an airline industry executive in charge of the FAA come 2025, I don't know that the situation there is improved. I have seen people make observations that if the Justice Department appoints a compliance monitor, that is basically telling the FAA, we don't trust you to handle this. We're going to have to do it ourselves. I don't think that is a terribly unwarranted insult to the FAA, because, as I've said, they have not conducted themselves impressively so far. We would have to make sure that the FAA has itself undergone a cultural transformation, that it's actually taking its oversight job seriously and has taken a lot of this back from Boeing, and it's going to keep it back from Boeing into the future. And we do not know who the leaders of the FAA or what the regulatory priorities of the U.S. government might be come 2025. If there's a second Trump administration, God help us, for many different reasons, but this would be one of those reasons. So I don't know that you could trust the FAA. There's certain Fredo Corleone aspect to its past behavior, and I'm not sure that they've transferred over to Michael or Sonny. Not that Sonny Corleone was a whole lot better.
I guess the last thing I'd like to focus on, although we have touched on it, is sort of Boeing as really the sole source supplier for major aircraft in the United States. And how do we keep that river of product flowing while trying to change all this? And is it because of their unique position as, if not the only, certainly the only major American airline manufacturer and one of two of the biggest in the world, are there even other considerations beyond some of the things we've touched on so far?
I think it raises some interesting questions about the nature of how Boeing sources its own goods. Most of its supplies, one of its big suppliers is Spirit Aerosystems, which makes aerospace manufacturing components. I think they're based in Kansas. They supply goods to both Boeing and Airbus. Spirit is not necessarily a good poster child for this either, but are you then going to absolutely insist that Boeing doesn't acquire Spirit Aerosystems? Or would it be better for Boeing to go ahead and actually, yes, acquire Spirit Aerosystems so it has complete control over its supply chain? This gets to many deeper issues we probably can't get into in this podcast, but when Boeing was building the 787 Dreamliner, which is a whole other kettle of problematic fish, and they had changed their fundamental strategy on procurement to rely more on companies like Spirit building components, and then Boeing would snap together those final pieces for the Dreamliner at the very end. And that was a radical change from the Boeing of yore 50 years ago, where Boeing governed absolutely every single step of its entire supply chain and manufacturing process, soup to nuts. Everything was under Boeing's control. Now it's not. But I don't know how we can undo that. I think that when Boeing merged with McConnell Douglas, I was like, when was that? The late 90s? That was probably the first step to bringing us to where Boeing is today, which is to say it is a financial engineering mess driven by money and profits more than sound engineering, as it used to be. But we're not going to break Boeing up into smaller companies that would compete against each other. There isn't going to be some new aircraft manufacturer that emerges out of nowhere to bring additional competition to Boeing and Airbus. I don't know what the answer is there. But, as I said, it points to the reality that Boeing is too big to convict. They're not going to give it a felony fraud conviction. They're not going to exile it and debar it from bidding on defense contractors. They're not going to boot it off of public stock exchanges. They're not going to lay off the tens of thousands of people who work for Boeing. None of that is going to happen. Boeing is going to continue operating, period. It's just a matter of how do we figure out the right mechanism to assure that Boeing's corporate culture will improve when it needs deep and pervasive change. And what we've done so far with DPAs has not yet worked. So what do regulators do next? And that's the question facing us, I think, this week. I think that they want to get a final decision on is the DPA violated or not. I think they want to do that by the beginning of July, and that's in 8 days.
Let's maybe end on a thread that you started a little bit earlier, and that is what should a compliance professional draw, if any, from not only our discussions, but what's going on? Is a threat of additional penalties under a deferred prosecution a real threat? Is Boeing so unique that a Tom Fox Energy company really can't take the lessons of it's just more money penalty, no big deal, because the department might want to make a poster child out of Tom Fox Energy Company and say, we're going to put you out of business because you're not critical to the energy supply of the United States, and we're going to show that we're tough. Or if something goes wrong, it's just, hey, it went wrong. Now, I haven't certified yet because we're not at the end of our DPA, but Ericsson paid, I think, additional $210 million above $1 billion plus fine and penalty. There have been a couple of others over the years where some additional penalties was paid, but the failure to meet the terms of the DPA or indeed violating the DPA seems to be met with an additional fine and penalty. And is that really kind of any big deal?
I think there are a couple of points compliance officers should keep in mind. First, I think, Tom, your point is very well taken that if this was a company in any of several other industries, say this was a felony fraud of a major retailer, like a clothing store, we would not be having this conversation right now. The prosecutors would be moving to put that major retail clothing store out of business because who the hell cares? The country is not going to collapse if Target or H&M or Walmart or some other business like that fails. We're not going to wind up with planes falling out of the sky. You'll just have to go to a different store. It is a bit of a unique situation here that Boeing is so critical to several major industries that we can't give it the corporate death penalty. That said, I do think that compliance officers should ponder the nature of DPAs and the facts that, for example, we don't have an objective standard for when a DPA is found to be breached. That is a very subjective interpretation based on terms of the original deal, who the prosecutors are on this case, what the interim reporting that you may have been giving during the DPA, what has that said? Does your company already have a compliance monitor under a DPA and you still messed it up? Or maybe you didn't have a monitor. That's going to affect whether the DPA is extended or not. But the other big question I have, Tom, is if Boeing's DPA is extended or renewed or whatever the verb is, would it then include a new requirement of the CEO and CCO certifying the effectiveness of the compliance program, which this current one does not have? And so far, nobody anywhere has actually signed one of these because the very first ones to come due are not going to come around until, I think, the end of 2024. But this DPA was signed in 2021, just before the end of the Trump administration, if I remember my dates correctly. But we didn't have CCO certifications as a requirement of prosecution settlements back then. Now we do. So are the prosecutors going to try and drop that into a renewed DPA here? Would they do it under other DPAs that might be up for renegotiation if you violated it? We don't know. But that's something I would keep a very close eye on if I were a compliance officer, because sooner or later, these CCO certifications are actually going to be signed and they're going to matter. And now it's sooner rather than later. And I still remain unconvinced about the practical utility and benefit of these certifications, but that's another big issue that I still think is hanging out there that nobody's talking about.
I think we're going to have lots more questions down the road. And I believe you're correct, Matt. The first week in July is a due date for the Department of Justice to make a decision, report to the Federal District Court in Dallas their intentions under the current DPA. So perhaps we can revisit this issue after that time.
Thank you, Tom.